So my name is Ana Nunez, and I'm a senior on the Pomona Student Union. So on behalf of all of us, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event titled Actualizing Free Speech, the Regulation of Student Voice on College Campuses. The Pomona Student Union is a nonpartisan student-run organization, and we put on lots of speaker events like this one, so thank you all for coming out for tonight's event. At this point, I would like to welcome President Oxby to the podium, who will share some opening remarks.
Thank you, Anna, and I'd like to thank the Pomona Student Union for their role in organizing this event, which I'm really looking forward to. It's a real pleasure to say a few words in introduction about what we've experienced through this remarkable series and why it's of particular importance to our community. Freedom of speech, especially now on college campuses, is a frequent headline in the media. Freedom of speech in academia, if not always at the forefront, is an undercurrent of everything we engage in. The promise and guarantee of that freedom is the invisible framework for the questions we pose in the classroom, the critical inquiries we make in labs or lecture halls, and finally for the discourse that follows in the public square. On issues that every campus should engage in, whether racial justice, gender equality, inclusion, politics, or religion, freedom of speech is an imperative for the kind of conversations that affect change. In light of current events and ongoing struggles in our nation and the world at large, I believe that a series like this could not have been better timed. In fact, we do not exist in a bubble here at Pomona and the Claremont colleges. Just last week, we experienced the strong push and pull forces in the free speech arena. I made a statement in response to the troubling events around a lecture at CMC, and I affirmed that Pomona College is fully committed to the exercise of free speech and academic freedom, and that in fact we have a unique opportunity and responsibility to bring challenging issues forward for dialogue. Before we begin tonight's conversation, I want to offer my thanks first to Professor Pardis Mahdavi for her extraordinary vision and hard work on this series. I also want to thank Dean Audrey Bilger and the Dean of the Faculty's Office, Dean of Public Programming and College Events Karen Fagan, and the events team for their support of this series and for tonight's program. And a special thank you, of course, to the Pomona Student Union. I know this is a series that will leave a lasting mark on me and all who attend. This concluding event, which is presented by the Pomona Student Union and the Pacific Basin Institute, will be no exception in causing us to think, to engage, and I predict to leave a lasting impression. Please welcome Professor of Philosophy Peter Kung, who will introduce the panel on tonight's topic, Actualizing Free Speech, the Regulation of Student Voice on College Campuses. Peter.
Thank you very much. Before I begin, I just want to first acknowledge and apologize that this event falls on Passover. When the event was planned in the fall, the conflict wasn't noted, so our apologies. So thank you for coming to the final event in this Free Speech in a Dangerous World series. As President Oxby already acknowledged, Professor Pardis Mahdavi conceived this series after attending a conference focusing on international scholars who were persecuted because of things that they said or wrote. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge Professor Mahdavi and also the support of President David Oxby, Dean Audrey Bilger, the PSU, and the Pacific Basin Institute for helping to put this event on. So Professor Mahdavi herself was placed under house arrest in Iran by a regime that was unhappy with her first book, which was on the sexual revolution. Just yesterday I read a story about the Hungarian government passing a bill that would effectively ban the Central European University from Hungary, basically banish the university out of Hungary. So I think in these international contexts we can all appreciate the freedom to say and to write and to think what we choose. In the spring of last year, the Pomona College faculty voted to amend the tenure and promotion requirements. So it's now said that good teaching is attentive to diversity in the student body and, quote, requires fostering an inclusive classroom. So many colleges acknowledge the value of a diverse community, students, but of course also staff and faculty, and the value of inclusive teaching. So, in short, I think we value both academic freedom, the freedom to say and write and think what we wish, and the commitment to the idea that free and open discussion is the best way to resolve disagreements. And we also value a range of experiences and perspectives that comes with a diverse community. And we want our community to be inclusive. So in her address to the first year class, ASPC, at the start of this academic year, ASPC President Christina Tong endorsed the view that these ideas, academic freedom on the one hand and diversity and inclusion on the other, are not mutually exclusive. So I think that's a noble view, and I think defending the view that they are not mutually exclusive takes work. I mean, it takes work, particularly when real-world events like the protest and blockade of Heather McDonald at CMC last Thursday seem to point inexorably to tensions between academic freedom and on the one hand and diversity and inclusion on the other. And I think as reaction to that protest and the blockade shows that this is not a merely academic debate, right? This is something that affects us personally in a lot of cases. So the point of this series has been to explore some of those tensions, the tensions between academic freedom on the one hand and freedom, inclusivity and diversity on the other, and to initiate a campus conversation to help us think through how to reconcile all of the things that we value. So we are so pleased to have two distinguished panelists to help us think through these challenging and timely issues. So Miranda Joseph is a professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Arizona. She's the author of Accounting for Life Under Capitalism and Against the Romance of Community. Conor Friedersdorf is known to some of you because he's a Pomona alumnus. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers politics and national affairs. Some of his recent works, some of his recent articles include When Diversity and Inclusion Are Tenure Requirements, which is about Pomona's own new requirements, and the glaring evidence that free speech is threatened on campus. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. So I think we'll begin with a couple of questions that I'm going to moderate, and then we'll try to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. So let me begin by asking each of you to talk about a college's or a university's obligations to its students. So I think a plausible starting principle is that institutions should endeavor to provide for each student an environment that's conducive to learning. So in practice, what does that actually mean? So I'd like you to talk about that principle and what you think it actually means. So of course it means classrooms and labs and dormitories, and these days we think it also means health services, especially more recently mental health services. But what else do you think that includes? And how do you think that principle plays out when some students report finding college campuses to be fairly hostile places? What, if anything, should a college do about that? And I guess I'm not just interested in the particular policies that it should adopt, but also what sort of norms it should work to engender. So, Conor, would you raise your name?
As far as the kind of norms that a campus culture should have, I think it's the same norms that a non-campus culture should have, to treat others as you would want to be treated, to be kind to one another. I think on a college campus particularly, it's important to recognize that being kind and even loving to one another is not in conflict with being unsparingly rigorous toward different ideas, and to separate attacks on ideas from attacks on people. You shouldn't attack people, but you should rigorously pursue discourse about ideas, even if that means fundamentally disagreeing with people and framing that in powerful or even provocative ways. But I don't think that those things need to be in conflict. And when I think of the kind of other norms I would want to see develop or persist at a place like Pomona, especially in the context of different controversies about free speech on different campuses around the country. One norm I'd like to see is the idea that if you got into Pomona College, it means that you beat out a bunch of other people who didn't get in, who were very smart, and and you made it in, and you're in this special community of people who are very impressive in lots of different ways. And I think to give due respect to a student, you have to presume that they have the capacity to confront ideas with cool-headed resilience, that they are capable of hearing things that they disagree with fundamentally, even ideas that they might find abhorrent. They have the capacity to think through those ideas and to formulate a powerful response and to stand up for what they believe in. And in fact, many of them will graduate from this school and go on to do that in society. Their contribution in America, in the world, will be exactly to stand up for their values against people who hold very different values. And it would sell them short to create an atmosphere here where they were never challenged and allowed to formulate that skill and to reach this potential that they can have for making the world a better place. I think that there's a particularly pernicious idea that I've seen in the campus debates that happened starting at the University of Missouri, at Yale as well. The idea was that marginalized students, this would be put in quotes, and sometimes it was a matter of race, sometimes it was a matter of class, sometimes it was a matter of gender identity, that there should be a special deference paid to the arguments of these students. This is a very tricky thing because one thing that I value and that a lot of colleges value is diversity. And the idea is that you bring in people with a lot of different experiences along a lot of different lines, and they have different life experiences, they have different insights. I think that this is absolutely true. I think where you get into trouble is the idea that some students aren't somehow capable of being disagreed with. And I think that this is a pernicious stereotype because it almost inculcates norms where these students are treated as inferiors. And just interviewing students around the country, I find that it's actually the opposite, that actually people who come from particularly different backgrounds, whether that's race or class, are actually some of the most resilient people who have overcome some of the longest odds to be to campus. And that many of them are very impressive in conversation and in protest along every other metric. So I know that that idea of deference is very much in the air in academia. I'd like to push back against it and say that the norm should really be everyone's ideas rigorously challenged and everyone treated as equals.
Thank you, Professor. Miranda?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's really great to be here and engage in a very different kind of conversation than the usual academic ones that I do. But I'm going to be the academic nerd that I am and take the question apart a bit before answering it. So, before addressing the question of norms, and presuming a set of students, I think it's maybe important to think about who are the students at any given university or college. Who's able to enter that space in the first place? What are the admissions requirements? Did your high school offer the classes that are among the minimum requirements for admission? In Arizona, it was the case that many public high schools did not offer the basic classes that were the minimum requirements of admission to college. So whole groups of students were excluded from the get-go from going to college. We might, of course, ask about financial barriers, especially as public universities have shifted costs to students as they've taken cuts in state support in many states. Student financial aid itself has shifted towards loans from grants. Pell Grant amounts have not increased as the cost of education has increased. I mean, I don't probably need to tell you that the cost of higher education is a burden to students and their families. There are, of course, some well-endowed liberal arts colleges, I'm not sure if Pomona is one, that value the diverse student body enough that they've worked hard to ensure their admissions processes recognize a wide range of kinds of achievement and accomplishment potential and thus don't exclude students from the get-go who would add to the educational experience of everyone there and also be able to benefit from what's on offer. So maybe Pomona does not treat ability to pay as an admissions criteria, but instead provides aid to admitted students who need it. And so maybe the student body here is in fact quite diverse on multiple dimensions. So then to the question of what should the college be providing. So once you're in the door and have laid out the money, you're undertaking the debt or your parents have, can you or will you succeed? I want to ask a question about what succeed means. Certainly in my experience, teaching for a long time at the University of Arizona, I find that, some students are earnestly there to learn, and certainly many of us are there hoping to teach students who are wanting to learn the substance of the topics that we're engaged with. But it's also clear that many people go to college to get a credential that will open doors to them to jobs or to further education, and thus higher credentials that then open to higher earning potential. So for those who are actually able to finish college, get that credential, the enormous financial risk that a lot of students take in undertaking college pays off. But there are a lot, certainly I see them probably more in Arizona than among the student body, who can't afford to finish. They just run out of money before they can get through the 4, 6, 7 years it takes to get through. They have family obligations to attend to, caretaking for parents or children. They need to earn some money right now. They can't be spending all this time in school. They need to support extended families, families who've lost members to prison, to deportation, to illness. There's some fine colleges, not their thing, or they didn't get in Arizona often the K-12 education they really would need to manage the tasks required of them. These students wind up stuck with debt, but without the credential. The financial debt did not pay off. So I'm implying here, right, that colleges and universities, that there is a norm of inclusion in the first place, that we should be educating. Certainly public universities should be obliged. Private ones, I think this is probably a little bit of a different conversation, but still, there's a value to being inclusive in creating the student body, and then enabling those who are included to succeed both at learning but also at finishing, getting the credential, learning some things, being able to pursue meaningful work. And I also hope gaining some knowledge of history and society, or at least strategies for learning about and thinking about those social dynamics that would enable them to participate in debates over our future, our economy, our social relationships.
Thank you.
One more thing. Colleges and universities are not a bubble. They do not create the climates on campuses by themselves. Talk more about that, but in Arizona, certainly the impact of the passage of the laws, HB 2281, that tried to shut down ethnic studies in the K-12 system, and the Show Me Your Papers law, trying to by attrition by enforcement to chase immigrants out of the state, successfully doing so in large part, had an impact on what it felt like to be on that campus and who wanted to come, including things like we had a provost search, and all of the diverse candidates dropped out because they either didn't want their kids in school in Arizona or felt that they weren't going to be able to accomplish what they wanted in that environment.
Thank you. I do want to follow up. So I guess what I was trying to frame this question in the way to ask, what are a college's obligations when students find the campus hostile? So I wanted to ask about the way that colleges were when I was in college 30 years ago. So I think back to my own college experience. I think that colleges and universities 30 years ago were pretty unfriendly places to, for example, LGBTQ people. And I'm specifically not, I want to exclude statements whose content was anti-gay. So I'm not talking about a student asserting in class that she believes that homosexuality is immoral. I'm just talking about an atmosphere where people routinely use gay as pejorative, or where they make jokes about how, that have as a sort of presupposition that homosexual acts are disgusting, right? Where they feel totally comfortable caricaturing gay people to make jokes. So, right, I'm not talking about, well, this is my idea, I'm going to defend it, but just a general atmosphere that is extremely hostile, and it makes it difficult for an already embattled minority to exist, much less to learn. And so what I want to know is, when you said that we should be kind to one another, like, what should the college do when we're not?
I certainly think that there's a community obligation to stand up for any group of people that is being disparaged, that is being treated badly, that's being bullied.
So I did want to say, the reason I picked 30 years ago is because the community standard was that was totally permissible, right? So I think that I don't want to sort of say like, well, it'd be much better if 30 years ago we had some of the norms we have now. I want to know, it's like, well, if you're administrator 30 years ago, what do you do?
I find it hard to separate a time 30 years ago when the community standards were such as they were. I mean, the reason community standards were unfriendly toward gays was that even the administrators would be unfriendly toward that group of people. The administrators and the students don't always exist in totally the same community context, but by and large, that's the case with the kinds of things you're talking about. And one way I think about injurious speech, just thinking about the First Amendment and free speech in general in our society, I had this debate once with Jelani Cobb, the wonderful writer for The New Yorker, and we were talking about free speech on campus, and he made a point about Birth of the Nation, the movie that gave rise to a renewed version of the Ku Klux Klan, and President Wilson airing it in the White House, showing it in the White House. And his point, what he said was, look, I support free speech a lot, but free speech in the First Amendment, they aren't always for the good. Here's this example of the President of the United States showing this movie in the White House that gave rise to racial terrorism, right? My response to that was basically that that isn't an argument against the First Amendment, because if you live in a society where even the President of the United States is willing to show the most awful racism in the White House, that isn't speech that the authority figures would be punishing, right? That by definition isn't what the First Amendment is protecting, because the First Amendment is protecting things that Congress and the President want to punish, but they can't because this First Amendment is saying no. It isn't very often that there is a group that is both so marginalized that they're being attacked from all sides and the community standards are arrayed against them, and at the same time they're so powerful that they can shape the rules that govern speech. You won't find a lot of cases in history, I don't think right now either, where those two things are both true at once, and that's kind of how I look at this issue.
Professor Miranda?
I think I agree with a lot of what Conor just said there, in the sense that it is often the case that university leaders are participate in the oppressive norms they might hope they would stand against, and do so often for practical reasons. So at the University of Arizona, both by desire and on the basis of educational research that we were looking at, we recognized that if the campus was to be carved out as a space where students of color would feel welcome despite the statements being made by our political leaders in the state, laws being passed in the state, that a number of things would have to happen, right? The president of the university would have to speak up, actually make a statement saying, we welcome students of color here. We disagree with the policy banning ethnic studies in K-12. We have ethnic studies on campus, and we think that it is a legitimate area of scholarship. Or, right, statements would have needed to be made. But in Arizona, our presidents have been cautious in general. They're employed by, their bosses are Board of Regents that are political appointees of those same political leaders that we were hoping they might speak against. And the budget comes in smaller and smaller and smaller part, but still some, from the state legislature. So they've been very cautious. What we've been able to do there is have some groups of faculty and faculty leaders be willing to take somewhat bolder stance in the effort to just start to create a different set of norms for the campus to say, yes, wait, we don't agree with the state policies. So yes, because of the impact on campuses as shown by educational research, that they're impacted by government policy, programs, initiatives, by social historical forces beyond the campus, as well as institutional histories, actions and statements need to be taken.
Okay, I have more questions about that, but maybe I'll leave that for the audience to follow up on. I guess I'd like to turn to something that's on a lot of people's minds on our campuses these days, and that's speaker invitations and disinvitations. So this past Thursday, Heather McDonald, who's an outspoken critic of the Black Lives Matter movement, was scheduled to give a talk at the CMC Athenaeum titled War on Police. Protesters attempted to blockade the entrance to the Athenaeum to prevent people from hearing her. And in a posted statement, the protesters argued that, quote, as a community, we cannot and will not allow fascism to have a platform, end quote. So various members of the audience might ask questions about the protesters' tactics, but I just wanted to ask about the initial invitation and about how you think that we should think about invitations. This was obviously an invitation to which the protesters objected. So giving a public address on a college campus is a privilege. So how do you think that colleges should decide to whom they give that privilege? Brandon, do you want to take this one first?
So first, I just want to say that I think that who colleges invite is kind of an interesting thing. Most speakers on campus, this event, right, were invited by a particular student group. Most speakers are invited by an individual faculty member who's got some funding to bring somebody in who can give a talk on their research area that maybe a handful of their colleagues will also, and graduate students might also be interested in. There's rare occasions on which the university invites a speaker. Graduation, right? There are few campus-wide official invitations of that kind. There are people brought in most often to participate in ongoing conversations within academic fields by the people in those areas. That said, my sense of this question has been shaped by a particular experience that I had a few years ago. In the spring of 2010, after those Arizona laws were passed, a colleague of mine in gender and women's studies there, Sandra K. Soto, gave the faculty speech, was invited by the dean to do so at the convocation of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, so sort of like a graduation ceremony, but just for the college. Arena, 5,000 people, the graduates and their families, right, Arizona's big school. We wrote an essay about it afterwards, and I'll read a little bit from that in and out because I think it really gives a sense of how I would think about these things. So in her talk, Soto observed the conventions of a graduation speech opening with a joke at the expense of a rival school, congratulating parents and graduates, flattering the graduates, but also the institution and its faculty by crediting them with having learned both skills and information, urging the graduates to make use of their education to make the world a better place. But she spoke in the context of and made explicit reference to the raging political debate in Arizona over the passage of those laws. After invoking, quote, our civic responsibility to have educated, well-informed, and non-hysterical debate, and to develop solutions that are fundamentally respectful of human and civil rights, she explicitly aligned herself with those high school students who had been protesting HB 2281, the anti-ethnic studies law. Her words were met with booing. She was shouted down, and it was only with the intervention of the dean up on the stage and her own, frankly, remarkable fortitude that she persisted to complete her planned remarks. And I have to say, sitting in the front row, it was an incredible experience to be in this arena with 5,000 people. The booing was louder, but I know that there were people on all sides of the issue, but there was a lot of noise being made in this moment. After the event, a video of the second half of the speech was posted on YouTube, then circulated in local and national media. Soto received hundreds of email messages, which I actually took on the task of reading, having at least a little bit more distance from the content. They weren't addressed to me, so it's a little easier for me to take. They were actually about evenly divided between those that were appreciative of what she had done and those that were negative. Clearly, though, for those who saw it negatively, her stature as a tenured professor at Research One institution, visibly underscored by academic regalia, her place at the podium, was cross-cut, if not undercut, by her Spanish surname and the socially determined racial interpretations of her physical attributes, even before she spoke a word. The conservative blogger who captured the speech on video and posted the second half to YouTube unwittingly also exposed racist speech acts as the recording picked up background comments from audience members, people who presumably were unaware that their comments were being recorded. This is America. Go back to El Salvador. Cut your hair, bitch. We responded in writing with an essay interpreting the negative responses. And I would say that those comments that were captured on the video were more polite than many of the ones that came by email. As we wrote in our essay, among the negative emails, we found most interesting as well as most common a claim that she had done something inappropriate, had ruined the graduation for students. Some went so far as to claim they had been injured. We argued that the claim of injury suggests that some of those in attendance felt entitled to a depoliticized or even privatized event free of political challenge. And against that view, we take a strong stand for what, borrowing from Lord Berland's work, we call live citizenship. That is a mode of inhabiting citizenship that undertakes political debate and contestation with uncertain outcomes. The one last thing I want to say is that we also do argue that the sense of vulnerability, the potential for injury expressed by those in alignment with the dominant view in the state, those laws that were passed, that sense of vulnerability was cultivated during those campaigns, which encouraged people to believe that any discussion of race is anti-white racism, that our borders, whose, are being overrun, that our place, whose, and our future are now out of our control. So again, I just want to emphasize that in analyzing history and power is important to really understanding what's going on, where are these claims of vulnerability and injury coming from.
Thank you. Conor?
If I were Anderson Cooper or Oprah Winfrey or someone with a huge TV audience, there are certainly people I would not invite to come on my program. I might think to myself, this person is a pseudoscientific anti-vaxxer who's going to cause a bunch of people to not get their measles vaccines and kill a bunch of people if I invite them on and make them seem credible. I think that there are different platforms that carry different responsibilities. Nonetheless, I've been a little bit confused about some of the campus speech controversies over, say, Charles Murray at Middlebury, and after he spoke there, a lot of people were asking, was he worthy of the Middlebury platform? This confused me because I think it misunderstands the place of campus and a place like Middlebury in the context of America. To frame this around a platform for Charles Murray at Middlebury, a tiny liberal arts college, for someone who has best-selling books and could meet and does meet with lawmakers on a daily basis, or could meet on a day's notice to shape policy with members of Congress, who writes op-eds in the New York Times and speaks at the Aspen Ideas Festival. The idea that the question a place like Middlebury should be asking is, well, should we give a platform, seems like weirdly beside the point to me. I think a better question would be, can we frame this in a way where we challenge this person's ideas if we really disagree with them? Could we bring him around to our point of view? But most importantly, can our students learn from this? I think that is the biggest question that a college should be asking about any speaker that's invited. When I was in grad school at NYU, Columbia was a very controversial, hosted Ahmadinejad, the then leader of Iran, who by any measure is a terrible, repressive person. At that time, it was the campus left saying, yes, we want to have him and learn from this person. It was the campus right saying, no, we can't have this. This person is morally odious. I think in that case, the person was morally odious, and at the same time, it was worth hearing from someone who was exercising a lot of control about what they thought, especially because the event was framed in a way that would challenge that person. So I remember when I was here at Pomona, Pat Buchanan spoke up at Claremont McKenna, and there was big protests around it. It almost didn't happen, but then ultimately it did. I was in the audience and was trying to listen to Buchanan over the shouting, and I didn't know a ton about him at the time. That event caused me to do a lot of reading and led me on an intellectual path that prepared me a lot more to deal with right populists like Trump and to, in my case, write against them when years later that whole side of American politics arose seemingly out of nowhere, but it wasn't out of nowhere. You can go back and listen to a Pat Buchanan speech at the Republican National Convention in 1992, 88, something like that. I think, can this teach students something, whether because they're great ideas or because they're bad ideas that students should be exposed to because they're going to meet them in the outside world and need to learn how to hear them and challenge them. That and not whether a speaker deserves a platform in some metaphysical sense or something is the question that should frame these things.
Well, I guess I do want to follow up and ask whether you think of that, whether you think that this is sometimes framed as a free speech issue, as an academic freedom issue. I think with the idea that colleges have an obligation to sort of have speakers with a wide range of views. And as Miranda said, it seems like we have, when professors decide who to invite to give to give talks, we just have differences of opinion about who's worth inviting and who's worth not. And there's presumptions, like when the philosophy department invites speakers, we generally, actually philosophy might be an exception. Maybe the art department doesn't invite speakers who are going to say that art is a total waste of time, right? They just don't invite speakers like that. So do you think this is a free speech issue, or is it just a debate, just a normal kind of debate about, who's worth listening to?
Certainly, I think that it is, at a public university, it is a free speech issue. If a student wants to invite a speaker to come speak on campus, there are First Amendment implications, and the law is pretty settled that they can, stand outside and gather a bunch of people around them and have a talk with basically whoever they want, including speech that I think is odious and that I would never invite the kind of person that would give that speech. I guess another personal view I would express, I would distinguish between, I would never invite someone like, what's his name, Milo Yiannopoulos to campus. I'm not thinking of his views. I'm thinking of, is this a person that is earnestly engaged with ideas and can therefore be learned from, or is this a troll? Now, at the same time, if students at Berkeley invite him, people can't come and use violence to exclude him from speaking. I do think that his rights are implicated, even though I would not invite that person. Private colleges obviously have more leeway. I would encourage private colleges to act as if they're all bound by the First Amendment, because in some sense they're training students to be leaders in a polity where these are the rules that are going to apply after these 4 years, and it's valuable to learn the rules for the system you're going to try and operate in and influence.
Brenda, any?
I mean, I think the question of invitations to speakers strikes me as a bit of a red herring. I mean, where the production of knowledge is shaped and the dissemination of knowledge is shaped is in the funding of research by the NSF, the Defense Department, corporations of various kinds that shape the work that faculty are doing as researchers, and then that is what they are engaging in and can invite their students to participate in and share in their classrooms and invite speakers to come talk with them about. So these high-profile incidents of speakers on, being invited to campus seems to me to miss the point a bit of, where the control or power over the production of knowledge and speech is really happening, which is a much lower profile. Like, Uber is funding research on that will contribute to driverless cars at the University of Arizona. Is that what those faculty members would really want to be working on if they were just following the next question that emerged from their previous experiment? Who knows? But that's what they're going to be working on. And there have been a lot of forces kind of moving in that direction. The Bayh-Dole Act of 1980 that allowed universities to patent and license university-based researchers to patent and license research discoveries made using federal dollars funding the research. Again, the kind of cuts to funding of public universities means they're desperate for the dollars that might follow their small bit of licensing, patenting, privatization of intellectual property and the commercialization of intellectual property. So, and then I also want to say I really value student protest. So even though I didn't agree with the opinion being voiced by the brewers at Soto's speech, I certainly do value many of the protests that have been occurring as speech, as an expression of a viewpoint, and as a collective expression, which is sometimes the way that disempowered groups have some power, is to work collectively, where an individual who has money behind them or the authority of the institution can speak as an individual with that power. A group of protesters is needed as an answer.
Can I just follow up briefly? Why do you think that these kind of speaker invitations have become such flashpoints then? So it seems like they generate a huge amount of passion, and so perhaps the idea behind student protests is like, look, we just don't want to kind of continue with the business of usual, just sort of musing in a kind of dispassionate way about like, well, what could students learn from, or what does it seem like is interesting? There's another agenda at play, which is why the reactions are so strong. Just maybe a brief comment. Conor, do you want to start?
It's a question I've wondered a lot about. There's a thing I don't entirely understand where, going out around the country talking to people about the election, I would often find people who were well aware that tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, tens of millions of people were going to vote for the other candidate, the candidate that they were not going to vote for, right? And in some parts of the country, it was, I can't believe those people are voting for Hillary Clinton. In other parts, it was, I can't believe those people are voting for Donald Trump. But people were willing to kind of be relatively laid back, mellow about those other tens of millions of people who are going to vote the other way, until a sign appeared on their street. And the idea that one of their neighbors was voting for the other person really bothered them, because it was right there. That app Yik Yak that caused so much controversy on a lot of college campuses was kind of the same dynamic. People were well aware that there were internet trolls. This is a generation that's on social media, on Twitter. They're well aware that there were vile sentiments out there in the world. But the idea that it was someone maybe on your campus, or at least within, I think, 1.5 miles of it, that was saying these things was a little bit more bothersome. And I think that's part of what's going on. This clash between college as a place to learn about and prepare for the world versus college, this place where you're trying to create an idyllic community, even a utopia. We may not be able to control that this person that we really dislike as president, or that Congress is controlled by people that we like, or that there's injustice out there, but at least in this little community we can create the kind of world that we want to see. And viewpoint diversity threatens that, because it forces you to confront the idea that there are people with very different values that you can't stop, you ultimately can't do anything about. That's as close as I can come to why campus speeches do this. They're an event. Protesters like events because it's someplace you can show up in physical space. That's probably part of it too. But that other dynamic, I think, is part of what's going on.
Right?
Yeah, I don't know that I know an answer to that question, although what I was thinking about in trying to understand what happened at Soto's speech was that there was it's about this sense of privacy, that the campus should be a zone in which, in fact, the students are consumers or owners, maybe, of their education and their educational institutions. Certainly the amount of money that gets, the increasing tuition burden on students and their families might lead them to think that. And so then should they be discomfited in this space in which they feel they have a kind of private property right to, and the education of their choosing, may produce, on both left and right and all sorts of other positions as well, a sense that that other views shouldn't be just protested but could be excluded. On the other hand, maybe it's just the kind of ripple effect onto it's just the kind of trickle down of the polarized national political environment. Certainly some of the speakers who get protested are ones that are figures on the news, in those cable, kind of news channel polarized debates. So they're bringing exactly that to the campus.
Thanks. I'll ask one more question, then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Concerns about free speech go beyond kind of outright censorship by administrations. People have written about norms that seem to chill expression. So I think the worry is something like that students and faculty fear being punished or targeted or ostracized, and certainly social media seems to exacerbate this phenomena. Punished, targeted, or ostracized for expressing their views, and they're hence less likely to express them, which the worry is stifling debate in a kind of unhealthy way. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, comment how you understand toleration and civility in the free speech context. And I think that you had a recent exchange with one of your colleagues, Van Newkirk, about kind of on this topic. Are there sorts of types of responses or a mode of engagement that is inappropriate because it sort of chills further discussion? Or is it kind of, I think when Jeff Stone was here, he's like, no, you have to have the courage to sort of take the fire if you say what you think. I can't remember who went first last time. Okay, Conor, why don't you start?
the more I've thought about this, the more I've come around to the view that the thing that I think does the most harm to discourse on campus and the thing that chills additional conversation, additional debate, is stigma. It's stigmatizing a person for what they say, and this happens in all directions politically. And I really think a lot of the problem would be solved by trying to separate ideas and people more, and to lean a little bit less heavily on stigma as I don't know, a weapon, a rhetorical move. I don't really know what the word for it is. It's not to say it's tricky, because I don't think that stigma is completely useless or never has a place. I think that if someone is using a racial slur, say, particularly at a public university where this is protected by current First Amendment jurisprudence, stigma is an appropriate tool. There's some hateful speech that I think ought to be stigmatized. But outside of those kind of far out cases, when someone is really using rhetoric that is mostly contentless, I think that stigma is a bad idea, that ad hominem attacks are a bad idea, and that you should attack ideas as powerfully as you want or you can, while still letting the person on the other end of it know, look, we have a disagreement here. I'm not saying you should be ostracized. I'm saying let's continue this conversation. And stigma is so powerful. Every time I read an article about a college campus, every time I visit a college campus and give a talk, I always give my email address out. By the way, it's connor@theatlantic.com if anyone wants to write me. And I say, I know people don't like to ask questions in public sometimes, but if you want to disagree with me or you want to ask a question, talk about anything, my email inbox is open to you. And I was surprised by how many both, all the way up to tenured faculty members and lots of students, will write me and they'll say, please don't ever use my name, don't ever tell anyone that I said this, but here's something I'm thinking, or here's this controversy that's worrying me. And almost always, the thing that they're saying, you can't believe that they're so concerned about saying this out loud, because they're saying a view that's probably the majority opinion at their institution. Certainly that is well within the mainstream of, I don't think I've ever heard anything that couldn't appear on the op-ed page of the New York Times. And people are so nervous about saying it with their name attached. And I think it's because technology partly has brought us to a place where it feels as though at any moment something you say or a recording of you or something could be put on the internet and you would immediately have thousands of people very angry and attacking you. And we haven't acclimated to those kinds of norms yet. So I'll leave it there and leave more time for questions.
I'm certainly familiar with the problem of chilling effects. At one of the meetings about the effects on the campus of the political environment in the state of Arizona, a journalism professor explained that she was actually in that moment nervous to teach her students about the meanings and uses of various terms referring to race and ethnicity. Latino, Hispanic versus Chicano versus Mexican American journalism students might actually need to know which was the right term in a given moment, but she was afraid that the lesson would be misinterpreted, reported out to the press or the legislature, bring on some kind of attack from the students or wider public. And I personally, as an instructor of introductory level LGBTQ courses in Arizona, have at times selected topics and materials with an eye to avoiding controversy. These controversies can be time-consuming, exhausting, in various ways. Do you want to go there? Meanwhile, of course, there have been a number of prominent incidents in which student protests have received harsh response by police and criminal justice apparatus. Protests that bring on this response seem to be most often those where tuition and funding policies are being protested, actually. Right, so the pepper spraying of the student protesters at Davis a couple of years ago, At the University of Minnesota, where I've been visiting for the last year, students were arrested for their protests at a Board of Regents meeting around potential tuition increase, and the university administration has not seen fit to drop the charges. And then, of course, there have been kind of concerted efforts to intimidate those who would dare to speak out against the policies of the Israeli state in relation to Palestine. There seems to be a network of nonprofit organizations, reportedly to some extent coordinated by an agency of the Israeli government itself, that's undertaking campaigns of harassment of its critics. Massive Freedom of Information Act requests that are burdensome to the institution as well as the individual, demands for the firing of professors, in some cases backed up with threats to withdraw financial donations, in some cases successful. So there are, powerful efforts to shut people down that are, I think, strong enough that some people would be chilled by them, and reasonably so. But dangers to speech are not only around, or the chilling of speech is not only around hot political and social topics. We did a survey about academic freedom at the University of Arizona, and for faculty members, the biggest threat was not political in the usual sense of these political issues. They were concerned about expressing criticism of the university administration. That is, even despite tenure, they saw themselves as vulnerable to the employment hierarchy of the university, to their bosses. And of course, there are many faculty now not protected by the tenure system in a big public university at least. Many faculty in administrative roles, such as department chair or dean, who serve at the pleasure of the next one up the management food chain. So this sense of vulnerability to the power structure of the institution is also reasonable. But I want to address for a minute the last part of the question that's about style and manner of speech. The question seems to invite an endorsement maybe of civil discourse, of a mode of response to speech that observes certain social norms.
No, I was really just baffled by what people mean by that.
And I'm wary of celebrating or endorsing civility as a norm. The term itself, check the OED, linked to a set of definitions that entail drawing exclusionary boundaries, monitoring conformity with social norms, the class hierarchy, maintaining the status quo. It's about citizenship and civil order. It has senses relating to culture and civilized behavior, civilization, which is a hierarchy term, right? Always opposed to something uncivilized. And some of the recent, so it seems like civility and calls for civility can really be calls for conformity to particular sets of norms of polite speech imposed by a dominant social group as a condition of political or economic participation. Another small example from my own life, I grew up in New York in a milieu of well-educated Jewish professionals, writers, lawyers, shrinks. Their style of interaction, perfectly normal and civil in my eyes, apparently stood out at least a few years ago in Tucson, Arizona. A woman who seemed immediately familiar to me, remarkably similar to the mothers of some of my high school friends, came to interview for a job in my department. She was criticized as abrasive and rude by a number of colleagues. Meanwhile, this is just one example. It's common for women, especially women of color, when they assert themselves in ways that would seem completely normal for men, they're criticized as likewise abrasive. So a requirement of civility can be too easily, I think, deployed to keep people in their place or define the boundaries of the group to exclude those who are different.
Great, that was very helpful. Thank you. So why don't we open up to audience questions? Do we have mics? Okay, yeah. So if you have questions, Anna, do you want to kind of keep an eye on who's?
Well, first, we give a round of applause.
I'll say it from here. My name is Goddess. I'm a first year at Pomona. Thank you for coming. And so my question goes back to one of the earlier ones that was asked. And I know, Miranda, you kind of talked about it. So it goes back to inclusion on campus and what specifically colleges can do. So I guess the first part of that question is who gets to define what inclusiveness looks like, and then what exactly does it look like? And specifically speaking, like I know you said the president of Arizona, in relation to the laws, could have issued a statement, but we know that statements, it's easy to like something on Facebook, it's easy to issue a statement, but
Apparently not so easy in Arizona, but anyway, yes.
it's harder, but those aren't per se the most significant action that one person could take. So maybe a different way of asserting inclusion on campus could be increasing funding or increasing support resources to an ethnic studies department. So what specific ways along those lines could a campus assert inclusion on that? And the first part of that question was who gets to decide what inclusion looks like?
Yeah, good question. I appreciate that. So I do think you said increasing funding. I think one of the things is financial aid policies. So and tuition structures. Who can come, and who's enabled to come. So those kinds of policies are really important. I also agree that funding of ethnic studies programs, of the scholarly work and then the courses connected with that in fields that address questions of social difference, race and ethnicity, sexuality, gender, can, among others, can be really useful both as statements that there's a concern by the school as a whole about those issues, that they should be studied, and as creating spaces where students can engage in discussions of those issues with experts, where there is a kind of academic basis for those conversations. Also, there's all kinds of other programming that can occur on campus outside of the academic programming. So I think there's a huge range of potential, both policies and practices and statements that can be made in a given context. In terms of what that diversity looks like, that I'm going to say two things about that. One is there are clearly historically underrepresented groups on elite campuses, even on non-elite campuses like my own. Those things we can all objectively observe need to be addressed. But then beyond that, I think there are projects. There are political projects that we can undertake to advance our views of what diversity ought to look like. So that's partly something that I would hope that you would be active in shaping.
When I think about inclusion at different campuses I've reported on, the needs really vary tremendously from institution to institution that I've seen. At Yale, for instance, a thing that keeps happening is that Black Yale students are constantly asked for their IDs by campus security on campus. And this is partly because there's a relatively big police presence at Yale, and there's a lot of crime around Yale, and so there's people asking for IDs, period, in the way that there isn't, say, in Claremont. And this is just disproportionately affecting Black students. And so, what's a thing that Yale could do? Figure out why this is happening with their campus police department, and figure out a way to stop it from happening. If I think about Long Beach State, I think about the tremendous class diversity within that school and the vast difference in burdens for attending classes, with some students who are working 40, even 50 hours a week, and some students who aren't working at all. And so perhaps their thing that would best serve inclusion would be better financial aid, right? Or cheaper tuition, something like that. And it really runs the gamut. I think of speaking at Connecticut College, which was very white and had very few students of color, and maybe more students of color is the thing you need there, whereas Long Beach State is very diverse already. I just don't think that there is any one answer under something so broad and vague as inclusion, and that it's tricky because, especially in a small school like Pomona, you have an admissions office that is, you asked who gets to decide? The admissions office at the beginning gets to decide who is included in this institution at all. And then once an existing cohort of students are here, I think having the ability for them to surface everyone's needs, to make it clear that anyone can walk into an academic calendar's office or the dean of students or wherever and say, hey, this is what's going on for me, let's talk about it, whether I have the answer or maybe you'll disagree. And so I think you kind of have to separate the admissions piece from the once people are here, what do you do piece.
And I mean, I agree that it's historically specific. So in this moment, for instance, sanctuary campus policies seem like an important intervention. Policy both as a symbolic and a practical matter. And then as a practical matter, not only being officially a sanctuary campus, but also having legal support apparatus made available to students, foreign students who might be caught up in the new immigration policies, like actually providing, stepping forward to provide services when they're needed, as they are in this moment for a large part of many students on various campuses. So I think being responsive to the moment and the needs of the moment, I agree with you, it's different in different places. But that seems like a key issue right now.
Thanks, that was a great question. Other questions?
I saw it here first.
Should I just speak? Is that okay? My question's for Conor. You said at the beginning that you want the same sort of norms to be cultivated in the campus as in the broader society. But then you also said that the campus setting is fundamentally different than polity, because it is selected and it's full of really smart people, and there's an order of chosenness that isn't present just in the broader society. So isn't that a contradiction? And doesn't that mean that perhaps there are ideas or speeches that could be cultivated in the campus that maybe are too dangerous to have to be present in the broader society, or vice versa? Is there a distinction there?
I can't think of any instances of speech that is tolerated on campus and not tolerated in the broader society, just because private institutions can exert a much greater degree of control over what happens on campus than the entire country. But again, it's public institutions that have to follow the First Amendment. Private institutions can have all sorts of rules and can also select, if they want to, for relatively narrow classes of people. As far as economics, they don't have to be diverse by any metric if they don't want to be. I think because colleges get to select their students and then get to, if it's a residential college like this, put them in dorms and have them on campus and offer certain classes. On one hand, you want to create a comfortable learning environment for people. And so there's a temptation to make everything as comfortable as possible, to minimize conflict, right? To make sure that everyone feels safe and included. And those are all good things, and to a degree, of course, they should be done. At the same time, we're living in a country with radically different ideological and political profile, where the power structures that people are going to be interacting with, even if they just live in Los Angeles and they want to change something through the city council, but especially if they are looking at something on the state or federal level, they're going to have to deal with a much broader ideological range and with a lot of views that basically don't exist at Pomona, and yet are very powerful in the outside world. And it would be nice in some ways to pretend that those views didn't exist, but in fact they do. And okay, so I'll give you an example of this. When I was at Pomona, gay marriage was a long way away from being law in the United States. And I was always a relatively libertarian-ish student. I came from a Catholic school in Orange County. I spent a lot of time arguing with first fellow Catholics and later conservative Orange County people. Like, no, gay marriage kind of makes sense. When people thought it was just madness, right? Later I worked with Andrew Sullivan, who was one of the earliest writers talking about gay marriage, and spent a lot of time guest blogging for him and dealing with the debate when it was like states were actually starting to pass this and it was going up in the Supreme Court. I worked at Right of Center web magazines, had all the arguments. Now on most college campuses, gay marriage is thought of as a thing. Of course we have this. It would be social suicide in some places to say you oppose this, right? It's not a live debate on campus, even though like 40% of the country is still against it. So now we have a new Supreme Court nominee, Gorsuch. And is it possible that the gay marriage case could be overturned? I don't actually think it's going to happen, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility. Certainly possible that 10 years from now, you could go into a state, say Alabama, and they might still be arguing about whether gay marriage should be legal or not there. They might argue over it again because it's gone back to the states. I think I would be much better prepared to go into Alabama in that case and try and convince people that they should make gay marriage legal for having had the debate, compared to someone who has been someplace where they've never had to actually argue for the position because it was always the social norm and no one ever dared to challenge it. These are the kinds of things I'm talking about when I think that it is important for students to be confronted with really strong arguments that they find abhorrent. Heather McDonald is another really good example. I've been writing about police abuses way before Black Lives Matter. I have argued with Heather McDonald so many times and found her so enormously frustrating. She is nevertheless a relatively careful scholar of these things. And as frustrating as I find her, I appreciate that she will show up to criminal justice reform conferences, race and justice summits, and have earnest exchanges with people that are out there trying to push the kinds of reforms that Black Lives Matter are pushing for. She is the kind of interlocutor you will find if you go into a state legislature and you try and get a criminal rights reform bill passed. You need to be able to know how to deal with people like her, understand her arguments, and to deny other people in the college setting the ability to do that, I think weakens the cause of something like criminal justice reform. And so I really think it's important, and this is what I mean, to avoid the temptation to make campus into the most utopian thing you can imagine, because the reason to be here is to learn and prepare for a society that is not like this.
Miranda, do you want to weigh in? Or?
Just briefly, two things. One is that I think the relationship between colleges and universities and their surrounding environments works in a lot of different ways. So one of the things, in answer again to the first question, that happened in Arizona is that that faculty started participating in protests at the school board meetings and speaking back to the state legislature via those protests about ethnic studies. By showing up at those things, we clearly gave the university a different image, and at least the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, and we started having noticeably increased numbers of students of color in our classrooms. So, participating in the public realm in various settings shapes the campus as much as the campus being practice for being somewhere else. I think you and I agree that there's that speech is largely shaped by various kinds of power, money, political power, and we try to make campuses a place where the better argument is actually what wins, rather than simply force. With mixed success at best. Sure, it's a worthy effort. And also, when we think about speakers coming to campus who are taking big public political positions, I think recognizing that something like a debate over Black Lives Matter, that the force of the police, the forces that have enabled police all over the country to kill people of color, presumed guilty before they start, like that's a whole different level of power, and then status quo being endorsed than students saying Black Lives Matter, and the sense of fear and oppression that those students might have needs to be recognized. So I do think historical differences in power are really important, and all speech is not equal on a college campus or anywhere else.
And I think I should add a subtext to a lot of what we've been saying. If free speech norms or even First Amendment protections were to kind of disappear tomorrow, the regime that immediately replaced it would look a lot different at Pomona than it would at Arizona State. And I think in the long run, it would be bad for marginalized people generally if free speech norms went away. In fact, if there's anyone interested in this issue particularly, there's a great Henry Louis Gates essay that was published in the New Republic I think in the mid-90s. And it was about critical race theory in the first rounds of speech codes that were passed at public universities. And they were passed in response to pretty terrible racist incidents. Most of them were anti-Black racism, like terrible, I'm trying to think. Certainly almost everyone would consider it quote unquote hate speech, right? And so these speech codes were passed to protect against this kind of thing, and that was the intention. As it turned out, I think it was the University of Wisconsin, although it might be Michigan that I'm thinking of. I'm confused, but there were like 11 cases tried under this speech code before it was struck down by the Supreme Court. And in 9 of the 11 cases, it was Black students who were punished under the speech codes. Kind of going back to a point I made before, it's very rare that you will have a marginalized class of people who are both so marginalized that they need special protections, and also so powerful that the special protections that the people in power would pass would benefit them.
One more question?
I'm going to prioritize student questions.
So we've established that students should be more embracing of diverse opinions and views, but I'm really curious about what that means in practice, because I'm thinking in the coming weeks there might be another attempt to shut down a talk-based speech. So specifically, how do you think the administration and faculty should tackle or handle a situation like the CMC protest that happened last week, and how do you think they can take steps to create an environment in which students actually feel encouraged to tackle opposing views?
You want either one of us to answer, or both of us, or?
Yeah.
Brent,
I can dive in. It seems to me that protest is one form of engagement with opposing views. I was glad to hear that at the CMC Heather McDonald event, the police did not attack the students or arrest them, that they were allowed to enact their protest, and that people were able to also see the talk, though not in person but by a live stream. But the exchange of ideas occurred in a way, and I think that that's actually a good thing. So what should students be embracing? And it's not just for me, that's not about saying all ideas are okay, I don't care, or letting them speak, letting people whose ideas are actually an endorsement of violence, police violence in this case, speak without protest. I mean, I think speaking back in strong and collective ways is completely appropriate.
I tend to think a lot of these kinds of controversies are just going to be solved by doing a little bit better job with organization, ticketing events in advance, having live streams so that when an event is physically disrupted, it can still be broadcast. I think it's very important to go very far in making sure that people aren't able to shut down events that they disagree with and that this norm doesn't spread. I think that if it does spread, again, if you think about who holds power in this country in general, if you think about the kinds of legislatures that ultimately govern public universities and the kinds of measures they would take if they were controlling who got to speak and who didn't get to speak, it's hard to not be alarmed by the idea of physical force determining more and more who is going to talk. It seems to me that a lot of the speeches that are actually successfully shut down tend to be off-campus groups that usually involve a few students, but it seems to be more off-campus people. I haven't dug in too much to the one at CMC. Certainly that was the case at Berkeley. You had a large group of state police that were very reluctant to intervene physically because they had taken batons to Occupy protesters a few years before, and there are horrific videos and lawsuits, as there should have been. The trickiest question is, if it keeps happening again and again, at what point do universities start punishing students? I think that that's a judgment call at every institution. I think the answer has to be at some point. I'm not someone who, I wish there was some way around that. I don't know if there is or not. And I would certainly want to see commensurate punishments. I'm not talking about expelling someone and beating them up and throwing them in jail. But I do think there have to be some consequences ultimately if people are basically using force to prevent other people from hearing ideas on a college campus. And that has to be considered a relatively serious transgression in an academic environment, precisely because the norm would be so dangerous if it spiraled and kept growing and growing.
I think that's a great place to close. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you all for coming in. I hope we will continue to talk about these issues because I don't think any of these issues are going to disappear anytime soon. And we're going to be continuing to hear about them and continuing to debate about them. So I look forward to continued conversations with many of you. Thank you. Okay. I know some students. Yeah. Thanks very much.